ballroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, usually a cavern of polite whispers and clinking crystal, had descended into a silence so absolute it felt physical, a vacuum sucking the air from the lungs of New York's elite. The only sound was the hum of the high-definition projector and the frantic, shallow breathing of Arthur Sterling on stage. Above him, the colossal screen displayed the forensic dissection of a masterpiece. The ghost of a dagger superimposed over a rose, the spectral white of bone fragments embedded in canvas, and the scrolling text of a dead woman's plea. The image was grotesque, a violation of the beauty they had come to worship, but it was impossible to look away. It was as if the skin of the world had been peeled back to reveal the rot underneath. Julian Thorne walked down the center aisle. He didn't rush. He moved with the heavy, inevitable momentum of a glacier. To his left and right, the crowd parted, billionaires and socialites recoiling not from him, but from the truth he carried. They looked at him with a mixture of horror and awe, this disheveled man in an ill-fitting thrift store tuxedo who had just set fire to their temple. Julian didn't look at them. His eyes were locked on the stage, on the painting that stood there like a defendant in the dock, and on Sterling, who was shrinking under the glare of the spotlight. "Security!" Sterling's voice cracked, high and thin, echoing pathetically through the speakers. He pointed a trembling finger at Julian. "Cut the feed. Arrest him. He's deranged. This is a fabrication. A deep fake." Two security guards stepped forward from the wings, their hands hovering over their belts, but they hesitated. They looked up at the screen, where the X-ray clearly showed the broken tip of the blade lodged in the stretcher bar. They looked at the painting, then back at Sterling. The authority of the moment had shifted. In the face of such overwhelming, visceral evidence, Sterling's orders sounded less like commands and more like the desperate pleas of a drowning man. Julian reached the stairs of the stage. He climbed them slowly, the wood creaking under his feet. He walked past the podium, past a frozen Sterling, and stopped directly in front of the easel. He stood next to Eleanor Vane, shoulder to shoulder with the woman in red. Up close, under the harsh stage lights, the painting looked different to him now. The layers of varnish he had cleaned were no longer just transparent windows. They were bars. The red dress wasn't velvet. It was blood. Julian turned to face the crowd. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the microphone he had swiped from the tech booth, switching it on. The feedback squeal cut through the room, making people wince. "For 130 years, Julian began, his voice low but amplified to fill the vast hall. "We have praised the silence of this woman. We called it serenity. We called it grace. We projected our own desires for peace onto her face." He gestured to the screen above, where the infrared image showed Eleanor's true grip, the white-knuckled clutch of a murder weapon. "But art is not always a window into beauty," Julian continued, his gaze sweeping the room, locking eyes with Marcus Hale, who stood paralyzed near the exit. "Sometimes art is a wall built to hide the bodies. That's enough." Sterling lunged forward, trying to grab the microphone. "You're destroying the museum. You're destroying the legacy of Elias Vane." Julian didn't shove him. He simply stepped aside, letting Sterling stumble. "I am not destroying his legacy, Arthur. I am correcting it. You wanted a showstopper? You wanted the red to pop? Look at the screen. That is not red ochre. That is not vermilion. That is Arthur Blake. He is in the room with us. He has been in the room with us for a century." A gasp rippled through the crowd. A woman in the front row covered her mouth, her eyes welling with tears. The realization was sinking in, the morbid intimacy of it. They had been drinking champagne in a mausoleum. Julian reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the glass vial and the fragile, yellowed scroll of paper. He held them up to the light. The glass caught the spotlight, glinting like a diamond. "This," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion, "was hidden inside the frame, sealed in the wood. It is a letter from Eleanor Vane, dated November 14th, 1889. The room went deadly quiet again. Even Sterling stopped moving, staring at the paper with the look of a man watching his own execution. Julian unfolded the letter. His hands were steady now. He wasn't reading for himself anymore. He was the medium for a ghost. She writes, "He is in the walls, but he is also on the canvas." Elias drove the blade through the canvas. I heard the fabric tear. I heard the wood crack. He made me sit there while Arthur bled out on the floor. He painted the rose over the hole. Over the handle of the knife I was forced to hold. Julian lowered the paper. He looked at the painting. She wasn't a muse. She was a hostage. Elias Vane forced his wife to pose with the weapon that killed his rival. And then he painted a flower over it to mock her fear. He trapped her in this frame, forcing her to smile at his crime forever. And we have been his accomplices. Every time we called this painting peaceful, we silenced her again. Tears were streaming down Julian's face now, unbidden. He felt an immense, crushing weight lift from his chest. Tonight, the silence ends. Tonight, Eleanor speaks. He turned off the microphone and placed it gently on the floor of the stage. For a long moment, nothing happened. The world seemed suspended in the amber of the revelation. Then, slowly, the applause began. It didn't start as a thunderous ovation. It started with one person, the young art student he had seen months ago, clapping slowly, solemnly. Then another. Then another. It wasn't applause for the performance. It was applause for the truth. It was a mournful, respectful sound, rising like a tide. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder, piercing the walls of the museum. The spell broke. Sterling collapsed onto a chair, burying his face in his hands. Marcus Hale slipped out the side door, vanishing into the night. Julian didn't run. He turned back to the painting. He looked at Eleanor Vane one last time. The projection screen above flickered and died as the tech crew finally cut the power, plunging the stage into semi-darkness. But in the dim light, stripped of the digital overlays, stripped of the lies, she no longer looked trapped. The tension in her jaw seemed to ease. The eyes that had stared in terror for a century seemed, finally, to be looking at him with gratitude. "You're free," Julian whispered. Two NYPD officers walked onto the stage. They didn't draw their weapons. They approached Julian with a strange hesitation, sensing the gravity of what had just occurred. "Mr. Thorne?" one of them asked softly. "We need you to come with us." Julian nodded. He surrendered the letter to the officer, evidence finally in the hands of the law. He held out his hands. The officer shook his head and didn't cuff him. He just guided him gently by the elbow. As Julian was led away, down the aisle he had walked up as an intruder, the crowd didn't part in fear anymore. They watched him with respect. He walked out of the great hall, leaving the ruin of the gala behind him, walking into the cool night air where the police cruisers waited, their lights flashing red and blue against the stone facade of the museum, painting the city in the colors of emergency and justice. 6 months later, the autumn wind swept through Central Park, stripping the trees of their gold and rust-colored leaves, swirling them around the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The scaffolding that had covered the West Wing for months was gone. The banners announcing the Vane sesquicentennial had been taken down long ago, replaced by simple, stark black posters with white text. Julian Thorne sat on a bench across the street, a paper cup of coffee warming his hands. He looked different. The frantic, hollowed-out look of the insomniac restorer was gone. He had a beard now, trimmed and neat, and the lines around his eyes had softened. He wore a heavy wool coat, blending in with the tourists and the locals. He wasn't working in a studio anymore. The legal battle had been swift but brutal. He had avoided jail time. The public interest defense and the sheer magnitude of the historical discovery had seen to that, along with a very expensive lawyer paid for by an anonymous donor who turned out to be a rival museum board member. But his career as a high-end restorer was over. No museum would insure a man who hijacked a gala and cut open a masterpiece. He was teaching art history now at a community college in Brooklyn. It was a quiet life. He liked it, but today he had to come back. He finished his coffee, tossed the cup in a bin, and walked up the massive stone steps. He paid his admission, no longer an employee, just a visitor, and walked through the great hall. The memories of that chaotic night were faint echoes now, drowned out by the chatter of school groups and the click of heels on marble. He made his way to the 19th-century European paintings wing. The crowd here was dense. People were lined up, waiting their turn. They weren't moving quickly. They were shuffling, somber, like mourners at a wake. Julian joined the line. Slowly, he moved forward until he entered the main gallery. The painting was there, but it was no longer the centerpiece of a wall of trophies. It hung alone on a dark gray partition, separated from the other veins. The lighting was different, softer, focused, devoid of the theatrical glare Sterling had loved. Beside the painting, encased in a climate-controlled glass box, was the letter. The jagged handwriting of Eleanor Vane was illuminated for all to see. Next to it was the dagger tip, extracted from the stretcher bar by forensic anthropologists and now displayed as a historical artifact. But the most profound change was the painting itself. It hadn't been restored to its original state. The museum board, after months of debate and public pressure, had made a bold decision. They had removed the overpaint of the rose. It was a controversial choice, unheard of in conservation circles. To strip away the artist's final intent was usually heresy. But Julian had argued, through his lawyer, that the final intent was a criminal act of concealment, not an artistic choice. The rose was not art. It was a cover-up. So, the conservators who replaced Julian had carefully, chemically removed the pink flower. Julian stood before the ladies' afternoon tea. Eleanor Vane sat in her red dress, but in her hand, she held nothing. The paint where the rose had been was gone, revealing the dark, charcoal underdrawing of the dagger handle, and the raw, unpainted patch of canvas where the blade had entered. It looked unfinished, scarred. It looked honest. Julian read the new wall text, etched into a plate of brushed steel. Witness to a crime, 1889, formerly known as the Ladies' Afternoon Tea Artist, Elias Vane. Subject, Eleanor Vane. For over a century, this painting was admired as a symbol of domestic tranquility. Forensic analysis in 2025 revealed it to be the site of the murder of Arthur Blake, whose remains were concealed in the artist's home, and whose blood was used in the creation of the background pigments. The subject, Eleanor Vane, was coerced into posing to cover the crime. The rose she originally held was a later addition to hide the weapon. It has been removed to honor her testimony. This work is dedicated not to the artist's skill, but to the subject's survival. Julian felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at the people around him. A father was crouching down, explaining the text to his young daughter. A couple stood holding hands, looking at Eleanor with profound sadness. They weren't critiquing the brushwork. They were empathizing with the woman. They were seeing her. "She looks brave," a voice said beside him. Julian turned. It was Dr. Elena Rossi. She was wearing her white coat, her ID badge swinging from her neck. She had come on her lunch break. "She does," Julian smiled. "She looks like she finally put the burden down." "How are you, Julian?" Elena asked, studying his face. "Really? I'm good," Julian said, and he meant it. "I miss the smell of the varnish sometimes, but I sleep better. No more ghosts in the studio." "Sterling was indicted yesterday," Elena said quietly. "Fraud, destruction of evidence, embezzlement. It turns out hiding a murder wasn't the only thing he was doing with the acquisition's budget." "I heard," Julian said. He looked back at the painting. Elias Vane didn't get away with it. Sterling didn't get away with it. The truth acts like a solvent, Elena. Takes time, it has to eat through the layers, but eventually, it reaches the surface. Elena reached out and took his hand. "You did this, Julian. You gave her a voice." "No," Julian shook his head. "She always had a voice. I just cleaned the dust off it." They stood there for a moment longer in the quiet gallery, two people bound by a secret that had changed history. Then, Elena checked her watch. "I have rounds," she said. "Dinner next week? My treat. I think you've paid enough." "I'd like that," Julian said. He watched her walk away, her heels clicking on the floor. He turned back to Eleanor Vane one last time. The afternoon light from the skylight above was shifting, casting a warm, golden glow across the painting. For a second, just a split second, the light caught the corner of Eleanor's mouth. It wasn't the forced, terrified smile Vane had painted. It was something else, a relaxation, a sigh. "Goodbye, Eleanor," Julian whispered. He turned and walked away, his footsteps light. He walked through the halls of the museum, past the statues of gods and kings, past the armor of knights and the tombs of pharaohs. He walked out the great bronze doors and down the steps. The sun had broken fully through the clouds now, bathing New York City in brilliant, blinding light. The air was crisp and clean. Julian Thorne buttoned his coat, took a deep breath of the city air, and stepped into the crowd. He was just a man in the street again, anonymous and small. But as he merged into the flow of life on Fifth Avenue, he carried with him the profound, quiet peace of a job truly finished. The painting was broken, but the world was a little more whole. The rain in Manhattan didn't wash the city clean. It just made the grime slicker, turning the cobblestone streets of Soho into mirrors that reflected the neon chaos of a city that refused to sleep. But up on the 4th floor of the cast-iron building on Green Street, the chaos was muted, suffocated by thick brick walls and heavy velvet drapes. Here, in the private restoration studio of Julian Thorne, time didn't race. It crawled, measured not in minutes or hours, but in the slow drying time of dammer varnish and the microscopic decay of pigment. The studio was a cavern of controlled atmosphere, smelling faintly of turpentine, old wood, and the metallic tang of expensive solvents. It was a surgical theater for the dead. Julian stood by the window, watching the relentless downpour blur the streetlights below, his reflection ghostly in the glass. He was a man composed of sharp angles and exhausted lines, his eyes carrying the perpetual redness of someone who spent his life squinting through a stereo microscope. He rubbed his thumb against his forefinger, a nervous tic he had developed over 20 years of handling fragility. Tonight, the silence of the studio felt heavier than usual, charged with a specific kind of electricity that only arrived with high-stakes commissions. Behind him, resting on a heavy oak easel draped in a protective Tyvek sheet, sat the reason for his insomnia. It had arrived that morning in an armored truck, flanked by 3 armed guards and the nervous, sweating curator of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The object was insured for $85 million, but to the art world, it was priceless. It was Elias Vane's magnum opus, The Ladies' Afternoon Tea, painted in 1889. It was the Mona Lisa of the American Gilded Age, a portrait of domestic serenity that had graced textbooks, tote bags, and coffee mugs for over a century. And Julian had exactly 14 days to bring it back to life. He turned away from the window and walked toward the easel. His footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. With a reverence that bordered on religious, he reached out and pinched the corner of the Tyvek sheet, pulling it away. The fabric rustled, a whisper in the quiet room, revealing the canvas beneath. Even under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the studio's color-corrected lights, the painting was breathtaking. It depicted a woman, Eleanor Vane, the artist's wife, seated in a plush Victorian parlor. She wore a gown of deep, oxblood velvet that seemed to ripple as you looked at it, the fabric rendered with such masterful manipulation of light and shadow that you wanted to reach out and stroke the nap. In her delicate, pale hand, she held a single pink rose, its petals unfurling in a symbol of gentle femininity. Her expression was the painting's most celebrated feature. A soft, enigmatic smile, eyes cast slightly downward, embodying the ideal of the demure, content Victorian wife. The background was dark, a heavy curtain of charcoal and umber, drawing all focus to her luminous skin. Julian put on his optivisor, flipping the magnifying lenses down over his eyes. He wasn't there to admire the art. He was there to diagnose its diseases. To the untrained eye, the painting was perfect. To Julian, it was a ruin. The varnish, applied in the 1920s during a clumsy previous restoration, had yellowed significantly, turning the cool, crisp daylight of Vane's original vision into a sickly, jaundiced haze. There was surface grime, decades of New York pollution, cigar smoke from boardrooms, and the dust of millions of passing tourists. embedded in the top layer. "Hello, Eleanor," Julian whispered. It was a habit he couldn't break, talking to the subjects. They were his roommates, his confidants, sometimes his only friends during the long, lonely nights of work. "Let's get that mask off you, shall we?" He moved to his workbench, a stainless steel table organized with the obsessive precision of a serial killer or a saint. Hundreds of glass jars were lined up, containing solvents of varying strengths: acetone, ethanol, isooctane, diacetone alcohol. Beside them lay rows of hand-rolled cotton swabs, some no larger than the head of a pin. He selected a swab and dipped it into a mild enzymatic solution he had mixed earlier. This was the test cleaning. Julian pulled a rolling stool up to the easel. He sat, adjusted the height, and leaned in. His breath hitched and held. This was the moment of contact, the handshake across centuries. He chose a small, inconsequential corner of the background, near the bottom right, to test the solvent's reaction. With a circular motion so small it was barely visible, he touched the cotton to the canvas. He rolled it gently, lifted. The tip of the cotton was stained a dirty, tobacco brown. On the canvas, a tiny circle of pure, deep black emerged from the murky brown haze, like a star appearing through smog. "Good," he murmured. The varnish was soluble. It would come off, but it would be a war of inches. For the next 6 hours, the world outside ceased to exist. There was only the friction of cotton on linen, the smell of chemicals, and the slow, agonizing revelation of color. Julian worked in a trance state. This was the part of the job he loved and hated in equal measure. It was an excavation. He was digging through time, removing the debris of the present to find the past. As he worked his way from the dark background toward the figure of Eleanor, his mind wandered to the meeting with Sterling earlier that day. Arthur Sterling, the director of the Met, was a man who treated art like a stock portfolio. He had stormed into the studio that morning, his suit damp from the rain, his eyes manic. "The gala is in 2 weeks, Julian," Sterling had barked, pacing the length of the studio while the guards set up the easel. "The mayor will be there, the board, the press. I need this painting to sing. I don't want historically accurate grime. I want brilliance. I want the red of that dress to pop so hard it breaks the cameras." "I can't rush the chemistry, Arthur," Julian had replied calmly, signing the transfer documents. "If the varnish is cross-linked, it could take weeks to emulsify safely. If I push it, I burn the paint. You want a singing painting or a dissolved one?" Sterling had grabbed Julian's shoulder, his grip uncomfortably tight. "Just get the surface dirt off. Make her pretty. Don't go looking for trouble, Thorne. I know how you are. You start analyzing weave counts and pigment composition and you lose track of the goal. The goal is a show. This is the centerpiece. If she's not ready, or if you find some structural instability that keeps her in the lab, my head is on a block. And if my head goes, your contracts go. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Julian had said, pulling away. Now, alone in the silence, Julian scoffed. "Make her pretty." It was the directive of the age. Gloss over the cracks, hide the age, sell the fantasy. But Elias Vane wasn't a painter of fantasies. That was what always bothered Julian about the ladies' afternoon tea. Vane was a realist. His early works were gritty, dark, almost violent in their honesty. He painted street urchins, slaughterhouses, the gray despair of the docks. And then, suddenly, in 1889, he pivots to this: a perfect porcelain wife in a perfect velvet room? It was too clean, too abrupt. Julian swapped his swab for a fresh one. He had reached the shoulder of the red dress. As the solvent dissolved the yellowed layer, the red exploded outward, a crimson so deep and visceral it looked wet. It was magnificent, but as he worked his way down the arm, towards the hand holding the rose, a subtle unease began to prickle at the base of his neck. Restoration is a tactile profession. You feel the painting as much as you see it. The topography of the paint, the peaks and valleys of the brushstrokes, tells a story of the artist's hand. A confident stroke is smooth, consistent. A hesitant stroke is jagged. A corrected stroke, a pentimento, often creates a subtle lifting, a thickness where the artist painted over a mistake. Julian reached the hand. Eleanor's fingers were long, tapered, wrapped around the green stem of the rose. He applied the solvent gently to the knuckles. Snag! The cotton swab caught on something. Julian froze. He pulled the swab away and leaned in closer, his nose almost touching the canvas. He adjusted the rake light, a light positioned at a sharp angle to the surface to exaggerate the texture. There, on the back of the hand, was a ridge. It was microscopic, invisible to a casual observer, but under the rake light, it cast a tiny, long shadow. It was a hard, straight line of raised paint, running perpendicular to the fingers. "What is that?" Julian muttered. He looked at the rose stem. The stem was painted with fluid, vertical strokes. But this ridge was under the stem. It was a structural anomaly. It looked as if Vane had painted something hard, sharp, and straight, and then hastily covered it up with the soft organic curve of the flower stem. Julian felt a sudden flush of adrenaline. He shouldn't be investigating this. Sterling's voice echoed in his head. Don't go looking for trouble. The job was to clean the surface, not interrogate the substrate. If he started digging, he risked delays. He risked his paycheck. He picked up a new swab, intending to move on to the background drapery. He dipped it in the solvent. He hovered over the canvas. But he couldn't do it. He looked at Eleanor's face again. Now that the varnish was clearing from her cheeks, her pallor was more pronounced. The shadows under her eyes were not just tricks of the light. They were painted with a deliberate mix of violet and gray. And that smile, stripped of the warm, golden varnish, the warmth of the expression evaporated. The corners of the mouth were tight. The muscles in the neck were taut, straining against the skin. It wasn't a smile of contentment. It was a rictus of tension. Julian put the swab down. He stood up and paced the room. The rain hammered harder against the window, a rhythmic drumming that matched the beating of his heart. He was a man of science, but he was also a man of intuition. And right now, the painting was screaming at him. He walked over to his bookshelf and pulled down a heavy, leather-bound volume. The complete works of Elias Vane, 1850 to 1910. He flipped through the pages until he found the entry for the ladies' afternoon tea. Painted in the winter of 1889, this work marks Vane's transition into high society portraiture. Critics at the time hailed it as a triumph of domestic peace. It was unveiled just 2 months after the controversial disappearance of Vane's rival, Arthur Blake, a scandal that had threatened to destroy Vane's reputation. The painting served as a visual alibi, a testament to the quiet, pious life Vane led with his wife, Eleanor. Julian read the words, but his mind was back on that ridge in the paint. A visual alibi. He looked back at the easel. The woman in the red dress stared back, her secret locked under millimeters of lead white and linseed oil, the ridge on her hand, the tension in her jaw, the abrupt change in the artist's style. "You're lying, Elias," Julian whispered into the gloom. "You're a damn liar." He checked the time.
3:15 a.m.
He knew what he had to do. It was reckless. It was likely a violation of his contract. If Sterling walked in, he would be fired on the spot. But Julian Thorne had never been good at leaving a puzzle unsolved. He walked to the far corner of the studio, where a large gray machine stood covered in plastic. He wheeled it out. It was an Osiris infrared reflectography camera, a device capable of seeing through the upper layers of paint to reveal the carbon-based sketches and underpaintings beneath. It was the art world's X-ray vision. He positioned the camera in front of the painting, connecting it to his high-resolution monitor. The hum of the machine's cooling fan broke the silence, a mechanical intrusion into the 19th century atmosphere. "Okay, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice trembling slightly as he typed in the command sequence. "Show me what you're holding." He killed the studio lights. The room plunged into darkness, save for the glow of the computer monitor and the red standby light of the camera. He clicked capture. The screen flickered. A loading bar crawled across the bottom. Julian held his breath, his hands gripping the edge of the desk so hard his knuckles turned white. The image appeared. It was a spectral, grayscale version of the masterpiece. The red dress was a ghostly gray. The face was a skull-like mask. But the infrared light cut through the deception of the top layers. It ignored the rose. It ignored the green stem. It looked straight at the carbon sketch Elias Vane had laid down first. Julian leaned in, his eyes widening in disbelief. On the screen, the rose was gone. Completely gone. In Eleanor's hand, gripped with a force that distorted her fingers, was not a flower. It was a long, tapered object with a distinct crossguard. The ridge he had felt was the blade. The stem was the hilt. It was a dagger, a long, vicious stiletto, and she wasn't holding it like a prop. She was holding it pointing downwards, her wrist cocked. Julian gasped, the sound loud in the dark room. He scrolled the camera view. He needed to see the rest. If the rose was a lie, what else was fake? He panned the camera to the right, towards the heavy, dark curtains in the background, the area he had barely touched. On the surface, it was just shadow. On the infrared monitor, the shadow dissolved. Julian's blood ran cold. Behind the painted curtain, the underdrawing revealed a chaotic scrawl of lines. But they resolved into shapes. Distinct, undeniable shapes. Pair of boots. Trousers. A torso slumped against the wall. It wasn't just a portrait. It was a snapshot of a room moments after violence. Julian sat back, the breath knocked out of him. The glow of the monitor illuminated his face, pale and sweaty. He wasn't looking at a tea party. He was looking at a crime scene. He reached for the phone to call Sterling, but his hand froze midair. Sterling wouldn't care. Sterling would tell him to paint over it, to bury it, to make sure the gala went off without a hitch. Telling Sterling was as good as destroying the evidence. Julian slowly withdrew his hand. He looked from the monitor to the painting and back again. The beautiful lie and the hideous truth. He stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. He walked over to the painting, standing inches from the canvas. He could almost smell the metallic tang of blood beneath the floral perfume of the varnish. "I see you," he whispered to the hidden corpse. "I see you." He needed more than images. He needed proof. Chemical proof. He needed to know what that dark pigment at the bottom of the curtain was made of. If his theory was right, if his gut was telling him the truth, Elias Vane hadn't just painted a picture of a murder. He had used the murder to paint the picture. Julian turned and walked purposefully toward the chemical cabinet, grabbing a sterilized scalpel and a sample vial. The night was far from over. In fact, the real work was just beginning. The silence in the studio was no longer empty. It was heavy, pressing in against Julian's eardrums like the pressure change before a thunderstorm. The infrared image on the monitor burned a ghostly white hole in the darkness of the room. A digital X-ray of a century-old lie. Julian stood paralyzed. His eyes locked on the spectral outline of the dagger in Eleanor Vane's hand. His breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The rain outside had intensified, lashing against the fourth-floor windows with a violence that seemed personal. A chaotic percussion to the revelation sitting on his desk. He had to move. He had to do something. The image on the screen was just data, pixels arranged by heat signatures and carbon density. It was compelling, terrifying even, but in the court of public opinion, and certainly in the boardroom of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, it was circumstantial. They would say it was a pentimento, a rejected idea, a compositional struggle that Elias Vane had wisely abandoned. They would say the body in the background was a pile of discarded clothes, a curtain study, a trick of the decaying lead white. They would say Julian Thorne was a tired, over-imaginative restorer looking for fame in the cracks of old varnish. He needed the chemistry. He needed the physical truth. Julian turned away from the screen, forcing his legs to unlock. He walked to the stainless steel instrument trolley, his movements mechanical, dissociated. He felt as though he were watching himself from the ceiling, a lone figure in a circle of artificial light, about to commit an act of irreversible desecration. He picked up a fresh scalpel, the blade catching the glint of the monitor's blue light. It was a size 11 surgical steel blade, terrifyingly sharp. Beside it, he grabbed a sterile glass microvial and a pair of high-precision tweezers. He returned to the painting. The lady's afternoon tea looked different now. The serene warmth he had spent days trying to uncover now felt like a fever. The red of the velvet dress didn't look like fabric anymore. It looked like a wound. He rolled his stool closer until his knees almost brushed the easel. He adjusted the stereo microscope, swinging the heavy, articulated arm over the canvas. He didn't look at Eleanor's face this time. He couldn't bear the lie of that smile. Instead, he focused on the lower right quadrant, the area of deep, impenetrable shadow behind the chair, where the infrared camera had revealed the slump of Arthur Blake's torso and the pool of dark liquid. Through the binocular lenses, the painting became a landscape. Valleys of crackles, crackalure, ran like dry riverbeds through the topography of the paint. Hills of impasto rose up, peaks of oil and pigment frozen in time. Julian scanned the area where the floor met the curtain. To the naked eye, it was a muddy, brownish black. Vane had used a heavy hand here, slathering the paint on thick to cover whatever lay beneath. "Forgive me, Elias," Julian whispered, though he felt no remorse, only a grim determination. "But you left a mess." He found a microscopic intersection of cracks, a place where the upper layer of paint was already compromised. It was a flake, no larger than a grain of sand, precariously attached to the canvas. It was located right in the heart of the anomaly, the dark pool spreading from the hidden boots. With the breath held in his lungs until they burned, Julian lowered the scalpel. The tip of the blade entered the magnified field of vision like a monolith. He didn't cut, he pried. He wedged the steel tip under the lifting edge of the paint flake. He applied a pressure measured in grams. Snap. The sound was inaudible, but Julian felt it travel up his arm. The flake came loose. He quickly swapped the scalpel for the tweezers. With trembling fingers, he plucked the particle of history from the surface. It was a speck of dust to the world, but to a forensic chemist it was a library. He dropped the sample into the glass vial and capped it. The sound of the plastic cap clicking shut echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. He had the sample. Now he needed the breakdown. Julian wheeled his chair over to the corner of the lab where the heavy artillery lived. The Bruker Tracer 5i, a handheld X-ray fluorescence, XRF analyzer, sat on its mount. It was a device used to determine the elemental composition of materials without destroying them, but since Julian had already taken a sample, he could perform a more aggressive analysis using the benchtop scanning electron microscope, SEM, with energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, EDS. He prepared the sample on a carbon tab, sliding it into the vacuum chamber of the SEM. The machine hummed to life, the vacuum pump engaging with a low, rhythmic thrum that vibrated through the floorboards. While the chamber pressurized, Julian paced. He wiped his hands on his apron, realizing they were slick with sweat. He checked his watch.
4:22 a.m.
The city was at its deadest point, the hour of wolves and ghosts. He felt exposed. The studio, usually his fortress, felt like a glass box. Suddenly, a sound cut through the hum of the vacuum pump. Beep, whir. The electronic lock on the freight elevator in the hallway. Julian froze. No one came here this late. The security guards did their rounds at 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. This was unscheduled. The heavy metallic groan of the elevator cables grew louder. Someone was coming up. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in Julian's chest. The infrared images were still up on the main monitor. The painting was under the microscope. The SEM was running a loud, unauthorized cycle. He scrambled. He lunged for the keyboard, his fingers slipping on the keys as he minimized the infrared software. He pulled up a generic invoice spreadsheet, throwing a wall of boring numbers over the damning evidence of the dagger. He killed the main lights of the studio, plunging the room back into the shadows, illuminated only by the desk lamps and the glow of the equipment. He didn't have time to stop the SEM. He grabbed a stack of reference books, catalogs of Victorian textiles, and casually leaned against the counter, trying to block the machine's blinking status light with his body. The elevator doors chimed and slid open with a rattle. Footsteps, hard, purposeful soles on the wooden floor of the vestibule. Then the keypad of the studio door beeped. Beep, 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 click. The door swung open. Burning the midnight oil, Thorn? Or just burning the museum's electricity? It wasn't a guard. It was Marcus Hale, Sterling's personal assistant and the museum's head of acquisitions, stepped into the studio, shaking a wet umbrella. Marcus was a shark in a bespoke suit, a man who viewed art history as a series of investment opportunities. He was young, ambitious, and had eyes that missed nothing. Julian forced his shoulders to drop, forcing a weary smile onto his face. Marcus, I didn't realize the Met's oversight committee worked the graveyard shift. Marcus chuckled, devoid of humor. He walked into the room, his eyes scanning the space, dissecting the shadows. Sterling is anxious. He sent me to check on the asset. He had a nightmare that the roof leaked. The roof is fine, Julian said, his voice steady, though his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The asset is fine. Marcus walked past Julian, heading straight for the easel. He stopped in front of the ladies' afternoon tea. He tilted his head, studying the woman in red. She looks pale, Marcus noted, narrowing his eyes. Paler than the catalog photos. That's the yellow varnish coming off, Julian explained, stepping away from the SEM, trying to draw Marcus's attention. You're seeing the true skin tones for the first time in 80 years. Vane used a lead white mixture that gives that luminosity. It's supposed to be pale. Marcus hummed, unconvinced. He leaned closer to the painting, dangerously close to the area where Julian had just extracted the sample. Julian held his breath. The missing flake was microscopic, but Marcus had eyes like a hawk. And this? Marcus pointed a manicured finger at the background. The shadow here looks muddy. Are you going to brighten that up? Sterling wants contrast. Drama. I'm working on it, Julian said, moving between Marcus and the painting. But chemistry takes time, Marcus. You can't rush solvent action. Unless you want me to dissolve a hole through an $80 million canvas? Marcus turned to look at him, a smirk playing on his lips. Touchy. You look like hell, Julian. When was the last time you slept? Sleep is for people who don't have deadlines, Julian retorted. Marcus's gaze drifted past Julian, toward the corner of the room, toward the Osiris camera, toward the covered monitor. Then his eyes landed on the SEM. The machine let out a soft hiss as the vacuum stabilized. What's that doing? Marcus asked, his voice sharpening. I thought this was a surface cleaning. Why are you running structural analysis? Julian's mind raced. He needed a lie, and he needed it fast. A lie that sounded technical enough to bore Marcus but plausible enough to satisfy him.
Pigment identification, Julian lied smoothly.
I found some inconsistency in the red lake pigment on the dress. I need to make sure it's not cochineal before I apply the final varnish. Cochineal reacts badly to synthetic resins. Just standard due diligence. Marcus stared at him for a long, uncomfortable moment. The silence stretched, filled only by the relentless drumming of the rain. Marcus was calculating. He suspected something, but he didn't know what. He was a bureaucrat, not a scientist. Standard due diligence, Marcus repeated slowly, testing the words. Fine. Just remember, Julian, we're not paying you for research papers. We're paying you for a showstopper. If this painting isn't ready for the donor preview on Friday, it's not just Sterling's head. It's yours. Marcus checked his watch, a gold Rolex that glinted in the dim light. I'll tell Sterling you're on schedule, but I'll be back tomorrow morning. With the PR team, they want B-roll footage of you working. Make sure you look less like a zombie and more like a genius. I'll do my best, Julian said dryly. Marcus turned and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the handle, looking back one last time. His eyes lingered on the covered monitor where the infrared evidence lay hidden. She really is beautiful, Marcus murmured, looking at Eleanor Vane. Shame about the husband, though. Crazy as a loon, wasn't he? So they say, Julian replied. Good night, Thorn. The door clicked shut, the elevator whirred to life, descending. Julian let out a breath that was almost a sob. He slumped against the counter, his legs shaking uncontrollably. That was too close. Marcus was sniffing around. If he came back with the PR team with cameras, Julian wouldn't be able to hide the equipment. He wouldn't be able to hide the truth. The SEM beeped. Analysis complete. The adrenaline of the encounter shifted instantly back to the mission. Julian turned to the computer connected to the microscope. He pulled up the spectrograph. The screen displayed a series of jagged peaks and valleys, the elemental fingerprint of the paint flake. Julian scanned the graph. He was looking for the standard components of Vane's palette. Lead, PB, high peak. That was the white lead base. Expected.
Calcium, K, Chuck filler.
Expected. Manganese, Mn. Umber pigment. Expected. But then, his eyes locked on a massive, anomalous spike in the center of the graph. Fe iron. The peak was enormous. Okay, Julian muttered. Iron oxide, earth pigments, burnt sienna. That's normal for a dark background. But he looked closer at the ratios. He looked at the secondary elements. If this were a standard earth pigment, there should be high levels of silica or aluminum silicates. There were none. Instead, accompanying the iron, there were trace spikes of phosphorus, P, sulfur, S, and chlorine, Cl. Julian's heart stopped. This wasn't a mineral profile. This wasn't ochre dug from the earth. This was organic. The iron wasn't in an oxide lattice. It was unbound, chaotic. No, Julian whispered, backing away from the screen. No, no, no. He grabbed a bottle of Castlemeyer reagent from the forensic shelf, a leftover from a project he'd done for the NYPD cold case unit years ago. It was a presumptive test for blood. It turned bright pink in the presence of hemoglobin. He took the tiny, crushed remnants of the paint flake from the carbon tab. He placed it on a piece of filter paper. He added a drop of ethanol to break down the oil binder. Then a drop of the phenolphthalein. Finally, a drop of hydrogen peroxide. He didn't even have to wait. The reaction was instantaneous. A violent, shocking pink bloomed on the white paper, spreading like a fresh hemorrhage. Julian stared at the pink stain. It was the most terrifying color he had ever seen. It was blood. The dark shadow behind the chair, the pool under the curtain, wasn't paint. It was dried, oxidized human blood. Elias Vane hadn't just painted over the crime scene. He had scooped up the blood of his victim, mixed it with a little oil to make it spreadable, and used it to paint the shadows of his own living room. The wet-on-wet technique. Vane was famous for it. But now Julian understood the macabre double entendre. He looked back at the painting. The figure of Eleanor Vane seemed to shift in his vision. She wasn't just holding a dagger in the underdrawing. She was sitting in a room that, at the time of the painting, smelled of death. The man she was painted with, Arthur Blake, was literally in the painting. His biological essence was smeared across the canvas, immortalized in a museum, admired by millions. Julian felt a wave of nausea. He rushed to the sink and splashed cold water on his face, gasping for air. This was no longer an art restoration. This was a crime scene investigation 130 years too late. And he was the only one who knew. But why? Why would Vane do it? Why keep the weapon in the sketch? Why use the blood? It was the arrogance of a sociopath. It was a trophy. A private joke that only he and his terrified wife understood. Look at this beautiful life, Vane was saying. Look at how I built it on your blood. Julian dried his face with a rough towel. He looked at the clock.
5:15 a.m.
He had the motive. He had the weapon. He had the body. And now he had the DNA. But Marcus was right. The PR team was coming in the morning. Sterling was expecting a pristine, glowing masterpiece. If Julian went to the police now, they would laugh at him. They needed more than a pink stain on a piece of paper. They needed the narrative. They needed to find where the rest of the body was. And Julian knew exactly where to look. He walked back to the computer and opened the infrared scan again. He zoomed in on the area behind the curtain, where the wall met the floorboards in the painting. Vane had painted a decorative wainscoting there. But under the infrared, the wainscoting looked uneven. There were strange, vertical lines that didn't match the wood grain. Julian typed a new command into the computer. He needed to go deeper. Infrared could only see through paint. To see through the canvas itself, to see the structure of the stretcher bars and the wood panel backing, he needed X-ray radiography. He didn't have a medical X-ray machine, but he had a connection at the NYU Medical Center who owed him a favor for restoring a family heirloom. "Pack your bags, Eleanor," Julian said, his voice hard and cold. "We're going on a field trip." He reached for his phone, dialing a number he hadn't used in years. As it rang, he looked out the window. The rain had stopped, leaving the city washed in a cold, gray dawn. The sun was rising on New York, but for Julian Thorne, the world had never looked darker. "Pick up," he hissed into the phone. "Pick up, damn it." The line clicked. A sleepy, irritated voice answered. "Julian, it's 5 in the morning. Is someone dead?" Julian looked at the pink stain on the table. He looked at the dagger on the screen. "Yes," Julian said. "Someone is dead, and I think I have him in my studio." "Julian, you have lost your mind. Officially. Clinically." Dr. Elena Rossi's voice was a jagged whisper over the phone line, cutting through the static of the early morning rain. Julian pressed the receiver against his ear with his shoulder, his hands already moving, flying across the workbench. "I don't need a diagnosis, Elena," Julian snapped, grabbing a roll of archival Tyvek sheeting. "I need the machine, the big one, the high-energy digital radiography suite, and I need it off the books." "You want to bring an $85 million painting into a trauma center?" Elena hissed. "Do you know what the liability is? If you scratch it, if you breathe on it wrong, NYU gets sued into the Stone Age. And I lose my license." "It's already damaged," Julian lied, his eyes darting to the locked door of the studio. "Structural instability. I need to see the substrate integrity before I can stabilize it. It's an emergency, Elena. If I don't get these scans, the Met loses its centerpiece, and I lose my career. I'm asking you for 1 hour."
6 Uhr AM.
Before the day shift starts, there was a long, agonizing silence on the other end. Julian could hear the background noise of the hospital, the paging system, the squeak of rubber shoes on linoleum. He pictured Elena standing at the nurse's station, rubbing her temples, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun, weighing her friendship with a madman against her professional survival. "Loading Dock C," she finally said, her voice resigned. "The one by the morgue entrance. If you're not there by 5:55 a.m., I'm locking the doors and going to get coffee. And Julian, if you get caught, I don't know you. I've never met you. I'm just a doctor who likes pictures of broken bones." "I'll be there," Julian said and hung up.
5 Uhr 25 AM.
He had 30 minutes to package, move, and load a national treasure without alerting the security guard in the lobby or triggering the silent alarms attached to the easel. He moved with the desperate speed of a thief. He didn't have time for the standard museum protocol, the humidity checks, the shock-absorbing foam, the custom-built climate crate. He had to improvise. He grabbed the Tyvek sheet and draped it over the ladies' afternoon tea, the crinkling sound of the synthetic paper sounding like thunder in the quiet room. He taped the edges to the back of the stretcher bars with blue painter's tape, sealing Eleanor Vane and her bloody secret inside a white shroud. Next came the physical protection. He grabbed 2 sheets of corrugated cardboard, sandwiching the painting between them, and bound the whole package with heavy-duty stretch wrap. It looked less like a masterpiece and more like a flat-screen TV being moved out of a dorm room. Now, the sensors. The easel was equipped with a pressure plate alarm. If the weight was removed for more than 10 seconds without a localized keycard override, the silent alarm would trip at the local precinct and the private security firm. Julian didn't have the override code. That belonged to Sterling. He looked around the studio, his eyes landing on his library. Books. Heavy, dense art history books. He grabbed a stack of catalogs, the Renaissance in Florence, Baroque sculpture, the complete Vermeer. He weighed them in his hands. Roughly 40 pounds. The painting, with its heavy gilded age frame, weighed about 50. Close enough. He knelt by the easel. He would have to be fast. A sleight of hand. "Ready, Eleanor?" he muttered, sweat stinging his eyes. On three. 1, 2, 3. He lifted the painting with his right arm, muscles straining, and simultaneously slammed the stack of books onto the easel tray with his left. Thud. He held his breath, staring at the small red LED on the base of the easel. It blinked once, twice, then settled into a steady, rhythmic pulse. Green. The sensor accepted the weight. The machine was dumb. It didn't know the difference between a masterpiece and a pile of paper. Julian exhaled, a shuddering release of tension. He hoisted the wrapped painting under his arm. It was awkward, heavy, and terrifyingly valuable. He grabbed his keys and headed for the freight elevator. The ride down was a slow descent into hell. The old cage rattled and groaned, every vibration sending a spike of panic through Julian's nervous system. Don't drop it. Don't bump it. Don't trip. When the doors opened on the ground floor, the lobby was awash in the cold, gray light of dawn. The rain was still falling, streaking the glass doors. Behind the reception desk sat Kevin, the night guard. Kevin was 24, eager, and unfortunately very attentive. He was currently reading a comic book, but his head snapped up as Julian exited the elevator. "Mr. Thorne?" Kevin asked, blinking. He stood up, adjusting his belt. "Whoa, hold on. You're leaving? With that?" Julian didn't stop. He kept walking toward the door, his face set in a mask of grim urgency. "Open the door, Kevin. Now." Kevin scrambled out from behind the desk, blocking Julian's path. He was a big kid, broad-shouldered. "Sir, you know the protocol. Nothing leaves the building without a signed removal form from the client, especially not from the 4th floor. Is that the vein?" Julian stopped, inches from the guard. He shifted the weight of the painting, letting the fatigue and stress bleed into his voice. He needed a lie that was so visceral, so repulsive, that Kevin wouldn't want to investigate. "Kevin, do you know what Aspergillus niger is?" Kevin blinked. No?" "Black mold." Julian lied, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I was cleaning the varnish and I cracked a spore pocket. It's an aggressive fungal bloom. Ancient, toxic, and highly contagious to other organic materials. It's already started to eat the canvas." Kevin took a half step back, his eyes widening. "I have to get this to the decontamination chamber at the conservation lab immediately," Julian pressed, stepping into the space Kevin had vacated. "If I wait for paperwork, the spores will spread to the ventilation system. Do you want to breathe 19th century lung rot, Kevin? Do you want to explain to the building owner why the entire property needs to be tented and fumigated?" Kevin looked at the wrapped package, then back at Julian. The fear of the invisible and the fear of being responsible for a building-wide disaster warred with his training. "But shouldn't I call Mr. Sterling?" Kevin asked weakly. "Call him," Julian challenged. "Wake him up at 5:30 a.m. and tell him you delayed the emergency treatment of an $80 million asset because of a form. Tell him you let the fungus spread. I'll wait." Julian made a show of shifting the painting, as if he were ready to set it down right there on the lobby rug. "No, no." Kevin waved his hands frantically. "Go. Just go. I'll log it as an emergency maintenance exit. Just get that thing out of here." "Good man," Julian said. He pushed past the guard and burst out into the street. The cold air hit him like a physical blow. The rain was freezing. Julian shielded the package with his body, sprinting toward his van parked in the loading zone. He fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, and threw the back doors open. His van was a modified Ford Transit, the back converted into a mobile studio. It was climate-controlled and padded, usually used for transporting auction pieces. He slid the painting onto the carpeted floor, wedging it between 2 foam blocks, and strapped it down. He slammed the doors shut, locking them. He ran to the driver's seat, ignited the engine, and peeled away from the curb, just as he saw the lobby phone light up in the rearview mirror. Kevin was making the call. Julian didn't look back. He merged onto Broome Street, running a red light as he turned north toward the avenues. The drive to NYU Medical Center was a blur of wiper blades and adrenaline. New York at 5:45 a.m. was a city of delivery trucks and garbage barges. Julian drove aggressively, cutting off taxis, his eyes constantly checking the rearview mirror for police lights or the black SUVs of private security. He felt like a kidnapper. In a way, he had abducted Eleanor Vane to save her. He turned onto First Avenue, the massive, brutalist complex of the hospital looming out of the mist. He bypassed the main entrance and swung around to the service road, navigating the maze of ambulances and delivery bays until he found loading dock C. It was a grim concrete cavern, smelling of diesel exhaust and antiseptic. A solitary figure stood by the roll-up door, hugging a cardigan around herself against the damp chill. Dr. Elena Rossi looked small against the backdrop of the massive hospital, but her expression was fierce. As Julian pulled the van up to the ramp, she was already checking her watch. He killed the engine and jumped out. "I made it. You have 52 minutes, Elena said, not wasting time on greetings. She scanned the parking lot nervously. "The shift change is at 7 o'clock. If the department head sees this, I'm firing you as a friend." They unloaded the painting together. Elena had brought a gurney, a hospital stretcher usually reserved for trauma patients. It was a fitting transport. They laid the wrapped masterpiece onto the white sheets and strapped it down. "This feels sacrilegious," Elena muttered as they pushed the gurney through the double doors. "It's a painting, Julian, not a body." "It's both," Julian said grimly. They navigated the labyrinth of the hospital's basement corridors. The air here was different, sterile, cold, smelling of isopropyl alcohol and floor wax. They passed a janitor buffering the floor, who barely glanced at them. A gurney covered in a sheet was a common sight in a hospital. No one asked who or what was under it. They reached the radiology department. Elena swiped her badge, and the heavy doors hissed open. The room beyond was dominated by the machine, a massive Siemens robotic X-ray arm suspended from the ceiling, looking like a piece of future warfare technology. "Okay," Elena said, locking the door behind them and flipping on the light boxes. "This is a high-kV digital radiography unit. It can shoot through bone, metal, and plaster. What exactly are we looking for? A sketch?"
A signature?
Julian began to unwrap the painting. He peeled back the stretch wrap and the cardboard, then carefully removed the Tyvek. Eleanor Vane's face emerged under the harsh fluorescent lights of the hospital. In this clinical setting, she looked even more terrified. The red dress looked like arterial spray. "I need to see inside the canvas," Julian said, positioning the painting on the exam table. "And I need to see behind the stretcher bars. I found blood in the pigment, Elena. Real blood. And the infrared showed a dagger. But there's something else. The weight is off. The texture in the background is wrong. I think the painting is hiding physical evidence." Elena stared at the painting, her skepticism warring with morbid curiosity. She looked at the woman's face, then at the flower in her hand. "Blood?" she whispered. "You're serious?" "Deadly." "All right," Elena said, stepping behind the lead glass control booth. "Clear the zone. Let's see what she's made of." Julian stepped back, standing next to Elena in the protected booth. He watched through the glass as the robotic arm whirred to life, descending over the painting like a mechanical vulture. Initiating scout scan, Elena announced, her fingers flying across the console.
KVP 120, mais 5.
Exposure in 3, 2, 1. A low hum filled the room. On the bank of high-resolution monitors in the booth, the image began to materialize. X-ray vision is different from infrared. Infrared sees layers of carbon. X-ray sees density. It sees the atomic weight of the materials. Lead white paint appears as bright white clouds. Canvas appears as a faint weave. Wood appears as ghostly grain. The image on the screen was a chaotic map of density. The lead white used for Eleanor's skin was a brilliant, opaque white mask. The dress was a ghostly gray fog. "Standard lead distribution," Elena noted, leaning in. "Heavy metal content in the primer. Nothing unusual there." "Go deeper," Julian said, pointing to the screen. "Look at the background." behind the chair, where the infrared showed the body. Elena adjusted the contrast, inverting the grayscale. Okay, penetrating the lead layer. Looking at the substrate, the image shifted. The bright white of the face dimmed, revealing the structures beneath. There, Julian said, his finger stabbing the glass. What is that? In the lower right quadrant, embedded in the dark paint of the background curtain, was a constellation of tiny, white specks. They were too irregular to be pigment grindings. They were sharp, angular shards. Calcification?
Elena frowned.
It looks like bone chips, tiny fragments, mixed into the paint layer. Julian felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. He ground them up, he murmured. He ground up the bones and mixed them into the paint. That's sick, Elena said, her voice trembling. But it's not structural. You said the weight was off. Look at the frame, Julian said. No, not the frame. The stretcher. The wood the canvas is nailed to. Elena panned the camera to the edge of the painting. The wood grain of the stretcher bars appeared on the screen, straight, organic lines. But then, something caught the light. In the center of the painting, running vertically behind the canvas, was a crossbrace. Standard for a canvas of this size. But inside the wood of the crossbrace, there was an anomaly. A long, thin, incredibly dense object was embedded inside the wood. It shone bright white on the X-ray, opaque to the radiation. Is that a nail? Elena asked. Too long, Julian said. And it's tapered. Zoom in. Elena magnified the image. The object was about 6 inches long. It had a jagged, broken edge at one end. It's metal, Elena stated. Steel or iron. It's driven deep into the central support bar. Julian stared at the shape. It matched the width of the dagger blade he had seen in the infrared. It's the tip, Julian realized, his voice hollow. The blade broke. When he stabbed him, he must have pinned him against something, or missed and hit the wall. No, he looked closer at the X-ray. Around the metal shard, the wood grain was distorted, splintered. He didn't hit the wall, Julian said, the realization dawning on him with horrific clarity. He stabbed him through the canvas. The murder didn't happen before the painting. It happened during the painting. Elena looked at him, horrified. What? Arthur Blake wasn't just killed in the room, Julian said, his eyes glued to the screen. He was killed on the easel. They were fighting. Blake fell against the canvas. Vane stabbed him. The blade went through the canvas, through Blake, and snapped off in the wooden stretcher bar behind him. Vane didn't remove it. He couldn't. It was wedged in the wood. So he just painted over the hole. Julian grabbed the mouse from Elena and panned back to the front of the painting, overlaying the X-ray with his mental image of the surface. The location of the broken blade tip corresponded perfectly with the rose in Eleanor's hand. The rose isn't just covering a dagger, Julian whispered. It's covering the entry wound, the actual hole in the canvas where the knife went through. Julian, Elena said, her voice sharp with warning. Look at the bottom of the stretcher bar. Julian looked down. At the very bottom of the wooden frame, hidden beneath the canvas fold where it was stapled to the wood, was another density anomaly. It wasn't metal. It was a small, hollow cavity that had been routed out of the wood. Inside the cavity was a small, cylindrical object. Is that a scroll? Elena asked. A tube, Julian corrected. A glass tube, sealed. There's something inside it, Elena said, adjusting the contrast. Paper. A confession, Julian said. Or a suicide note. Eleanor. She must have hidden it there. She knew she couldn't speak, so she planted a message in the one place her husband wouldn't look, the back of the frame. Suddenly, the phone on the wall of the booth rang, a jarring, shrill sound.
Elena jumped.
She looked at the caller ID. It's the front desk. Security. She picked up the phone. Her face went pale. Yes, she said. She listened for a second, then looked at Julian, her eyes wide with panic. I see. Yes, I'm doing a calibration test. Okay. She hung up. You have to go, she said, grabbing Julian's arm. That was the lobby. A man just walked in. He's looking for a stolen art piece. He has NYPD with him. Sterling, Julian cursed. He tracked the van. He's at the North Entrance, Elena said, shoving Julian toward the back door of the booth. Take the service elevator to the sub-basement tunnel. It connects to the parking garage on 34th. Go. The painting, Julian yelled, running back to the table. Leave it.
Elena screamed.
If you're caught with it, you go to jail. If you leave it here, I can claim it was dropped off anonymously. I can't leave her, Julian roared, grabbing the heavy frame. The evidence is inside the wood. Sterling will destroy it. He'll burn the frame to save the museum's reputation. He heaved the painting off the table, the adrenaline giving him hysterical strength. He didn't bother with the wrapping. He just grabbed the naked masterpiece, the face of Eleanor Vane now exposed to the cold hospital air. Go, Elena shouted, opening the back door for him. I'll stall them. Julian didn't look back. He sprinted into the hallway, the $85 million murder weapon in his arms, running toward the dark, steaming tunnels of the sub-basement, while the sound of heavy boots echoed from the main corridor. The heavy fire door slammed shut behind Julian with a concussive boom that vibrated through the soles of his shoes, momentarily drowning out the distant, chaotic shouts echoing from the radiology hallway above. He was in the stairwell now, a vertical shaft of raw concrete and flickering fluorescent lights that smelled of stale air and industrial cleaner. In his arms, the lady's afternoon tea felt less like a painting and more like a tombstone. The gilded frame, ornate and heavy with plaster relief, dug viciously into his forearms, the sharp edges of the molding biting through his shirt sleeves. 50 pounds of oak, canvas, and lead white. It was dead weight, awkward and unyielding, threatening to overbalance him with every frantic step he took down the metal stairs. Sorry, Eleanor. Sorry, he panted, his breath misting in the cold air of the stairwell. He stumbled on a landing, the corner of the frame scraping against the cinderblock wall with a sound like a shriek. A flake of gold leaf fluttered to the ground, spinning in the draft. Julian winced as if he had been physically struck. He was a conservator. His entire life was dedicated to the preservation of material history, to the gentle removal of time's damage. Now he was treating a priceless masterpiece like stolen lumber, banging it against walls in a desperate flight from the law. But he had no choice. The woman in the painting was no longer just a subject. She was a witness in protective custody, and the men chasing him were not the police, they were the cleaners. He reached the bottom of the stairs, sub-basement level 2. The sign on the door read mechanical/HVAC/authorized personnel only. Julian kicked the crash bar with his hip, bursting into the subterranean underbelly of the hospital. The atmosphere changed instantly. The cold, sterile air of the hospital was replaced by a humid, oppressive heat. The sub-basement was a labyrinth of steam pipes, massive boilers, and humming generators. It was a mechanical forest of steel and rust, lit by caged bulbs that cast long, swinging shadows. The roar of the machinery was deafening, a constant, rhythmic thrumming that masked the sound of his own ragged breathing, but also made it impossible to hear if anyone was behind him. Julian sprinted down the central corridor, his feet slipping on the condensation-slicked concrete. The painting was slipping from his sweat-drenched grip. He hiked it up, hugging Eleanor Vane's face against his chest, shielding her from the dripping pipes overhead. He felt the vibration of the canvas against his ribs, a fragile membrane separating him from the murder weapon embedded in the wood. He needed a place to stop. He couldn't outrun a security lockdown carrying a 4-foot ornate frame. He needed to lighten the load. He needed the message. "Where are you?" He hissed through gritted teeth, scanning the maze of pipes. "Give me a corner. Just one dark corner." He ducked under a low-hanging ventilation duct, the heat radiating from it singeing the hair on his arms. To his left, a narrow service alcove opened up behind a bank of electrical transformers. It was dark, cramped, and noisy. Perfect. Julian dove into the alcove, sliding down against the wall until he hit the floor. He set the painting down gently, leaning it against the metal casing of the transformer. He collapsed next to it, gasping for air, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his sternum. He wiped the sweat from his eyes and checked his watch.
6:12 a.m.
He had been running for less than 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. He couldn't stay here. Sterling would have the building blueprints. They would sweep the exits first, then the floors. The tunnels were the only way out. They connected to the subway ventilation system and the parking garages on 34th Street, but he couldn't navigate them with the painting. It was too big, too conspicuous. He looked at the painting in the dim, amber light of the service alcove. Eleanor Vane looked back at him. In the shadows, stripped of the gallery spotlights, she looked even more haunted. The red dress seemed to absorb the darkness. "I can't take you with me," Julian whispered, his voice cracking. "I can't save the painting and the truth. It's one or the other." He grabbed the frame and flipped it over. The back of the canvas was raw, unprimed linen, darkened by 130 years of oxidation. The stretcher bars were sturdy American oak, dark with age. He remembered the X-ray, the hollow cavity, the glass tube. It was located in the bottom rail of the stretcher, concealed beneath the fold of the canvas where it was tacked to the wood. Julian ran his fingers along the bottom edge of the wood. The linen was pulled tight, secured by rusted iron tacks. He felt for the anomaly. There, about 6 inches from the right corner, the wood felt slightly different. There was a faint depression under the canvas, a hollow spot that gave slightly under the pressure of his thumb. He needed to get inside. He patted his pockets. Keys, wallet, a flash drive, no tools.
No scalpel. No pliers.
"Damn it," he cursed. He looked around the alcove frantically. He saw a pile of discarded maintenance debris in the corner. Old washers, lengths of wire, a broken pressure gauge. He scrambled over to it, digging through the grease and grime. His fingers closed around a flathead screwdriver. It was rusted, the handle cracked, but the tip was still metal. He crawled back to the painting. "Forgive me, Elias," he muttered, though he felt no guilt towards the murderer, only towards the art. "I'm going to hurt your work." He jammed the tip of the rusted screwdriver under the head of one of the iron tacks securing the canvas. He pried. The tack groaned, the wood creaking in protest, but it held fast. It had been driven in by a machine or a hammer over a century ago. "Come on," Julian grunted, putting his weight into it. "Come on." The tack popped out with a sharp ping, flying into the darkness. Julian moved to the next one, and the next. He removed 5 tacks, enough to loosen the tension on the corner of the canvas. With trembling fingers, he peeled back the brittle linen. The fabric cracked slightly, a sound that tore at his restorer's soul, but he ignored it. He folded the canvas back, exposing the raw wood of the stretcher bar. There it was, a roughly carved channel, about 4 inches long, filled with a plug of discolored wax. It was crude, hasty work. Vane hadn't done this. A professional carpenter hadn't done this. This was done in secret with a kitchen knife or a chisel by someone desperate. Julian used the screwdriver to chip away the wax, crumbled easily, dry as bone. Beneath the wax, the glint of glass caught the dim light. He tilted the frame. Gravity did the rest. A small, sealed glass vial slid out of the wood and fell into Julian's palm. It was an apothecary vial, the kind used for laudanum or smelling salts in the 1890s. Inside, curled tightly against the glass, was a piece of paper. It was yellowed, fragile but intact. Julian closed his hand around the vial. It was cold, unlike the sweltering air of the basement. It felt heavy, weighted with the gravity of a confession. Suddenly, a sound cut through the roar of the generators. "Clear left. Move up. Check the vents." Voices. "Close." Maybe 50 yards down the main corridor. The beams of tactical flashlights sliced through the steam, dancing erratically on the ceiling pipes. Julian froze. They were sweeping the sub-basement. He scrambled to his feet, shoving the vial deep into the inside pocket of his jacket. He looked down at the painting. He couldn't leave it lying out in the open. If Sterling found it immediately, he would win. He would hide the damage, burn the note if he knew about it, and spin a story about a mentally unstable restorer who damaged a national treasure. Julian needed to buy time. He grabbed the painting and dragged it deeper into the alcove, behind the massive, humming bulk of the transformer. There was a gap between the machine and the concrete wall. A narrow, dusty fissure barely wide enough for a person, let alone a masterpiece. He slid the lady's afternoon tea into the gap, face inward toward the wall to protect the paint. He wedged it in tight. From the corridor, it would be invisible unless you were looking for it. "Stay quiet, Eleanor," he whispered. "I'm coming back for you. Promise. I'm gonna clear your name." He turned and ran. He burst out of the alcove on the opposite side, sprinting toward the far end of the boiler room where the blueprints, remembered from a hazy recollection of the hospital's layout during a preservation consultation years ago, suggested a laundry chute or a service elevator. The flashlight swung toward the sound of his footsteps. Their movement.
Sector 4.
A voice shouted. It wasn't a guard. It was Marcus Hale. Sterling's assistant was leading the hunt. "Stop him!" Sterling's voice roared, echoing bizarrely off the metal tanks. "Don't let him leave the building." Julian didn't look back. He ran with a desperation that burned in his lungs. He vaulted over a low steam pipe, his shin banging hard against the metal, but the adrenaline masked the pain. He reached the end of the corridor. Dead end. No, not a dead end. A ladder. A rusted iron ladder bolted to the wall, leading up to a hatch in the ceiling. The label next to it read street level ventilation, emerg only. Julian jumped for the ladder, grabbing the rungs. The metal was slick with grease. He hauled himself up, his muscles screaming. Below him, he heard the heavy boots of the pursuers pounding on the concrete. He's going for the vents. Julian reached the top. The hatch was secured with a wheel mechanism. He grabbed it with both hands and turned. It was stiff, seized by rust and neglect. He gritted his teeth, screaming silently, and threw his entire body weight against the wheel. Screech. The metal gave way. The hatch popped open, revealing a square of gray, rainy sky. Julian pulled himself up through the opening, scrambling out onto the wet pavement of a service alley. He kicked the hatch shut behind him, hearing the muffled shouts of frustration from below just as the heavy metal lid slammed into place. He was out. He was in an alleyway off 34th Street. The rain was torrential now, a cold, cleansing deluge that soaked him to the bone in seconds. He was shivering, covered in grease, sweat, and dust, gasping for air like a drowning man. But he was free. He stumbled out of the alley and merged onto the sidewalk. The city was waking up. Delivery trucks rumbled by. People with umbrellas hurried toward the subway, heads down against the wind. No one looked at the disheveled man leaning against the brick wall. In New York, madness was just part of the scenery. Julian kept walking, putting distance between himself and the hospital. He didn't stop until he was 5 blocks away, ducking into the vestibule of a 24-hour ATM to escape the rain. He leaned against the wall, sliding down to the floor. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely control them. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the glass vial. It was safe. He held it up to the fluorescent light of the ATM booth. Through the distorted glass, he could see the paper. It was written in a tight, frantic script. He needed to open it. He needed to know. He looked around. The vestibule was empty. He took off his shoe and used the hard rubber heel to strike the cork stopper of the vial. It was stuck fast. He struck the glass bottom against the floor, gently at first, then harder. Crack. The bottom of the vial shattered. Julian carefully extracted the roll of paper, picking away the shards of glass. He unrolled it. The paper was brittle, the ink brown and faded, but legible. It was dated November 14th, 1889. Julian began to read, his lips moving silently with the words of a ghost. "My name is Eleanor Vane. If you are reading this, I am dead, or I have finally lost my mind to the silence of this house. He is in the walls. Arthur is in the walls, but he is also on the canvas. I watched it happen. God forgive me. I watched it and I did nothing. Elias invited him for a truce. They drank absinthe in the studio. Elias wanted Arthur to admit that his use of light was superior. Arthur laughed. He called Elias a decorator. He said Elias painted soulless husks for the vanity of fools. Elias snapped. He didn't scream. He just went quiet. He picked up the prop dagger from the model table, the one I was to hold for the Ophelia study. He walked over to where Arthur was leaning against the easel, mocking the unfinished portrait of me. He drove the blade through the canvas. I heard the fabric tear. I heard Arthur gasp. I heard the wood crack behind him. Elias wouldn't let me leave. He locked the studio. He made me sit. He made me sit there while Arthur bled out on the floor behind the curtain. He made me hold the handle of the broken dagger, which was still stuck in the wood, poking through the torn canvas. He said, "Hold it, Eleanor. We are going to fix this. We are going to make it beautiful." He painted for 3 days without sleeping. He mixed Arthur's blood into the background shadows. He said it gave the painting life. He painted the rose over the hole in the canvas, over the handle of the knife I was forced to hold. He turned my terror into a smile. He said if I ever told a soul, he would paint me next. Not on canvas, but in it. I am a prisoner in a frame of gold. This painting is my cage, and it is Arthur's tomb. Please, do not admire it. Destroy it. Set us free. E.V. Julian lowered the letter. A tear, hot and angry, leaked from his eye and mixed with the rain on his cheek. He sat there for a long time, the ATM humming beside him. The horror of it was absolute. The masterpiece that hung in the Met, the image of grace and refinement that defined an era, was a literal snapshot of a torture session. Eleanor's mysterious smile was the dissociation of a woman watching a man die at her feet. "I heard you, Eleanor," Julian whispered, clutching the fragile paper. "I heard you." He stood up. The exhaustion was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. He had the proof, but Sterling had the painting, and Sterling had the power. If Julian went to the police now with just a scrap of paper, Sterling would claim it was a forgery, a desperate stunt by a disgruntled employee. Sterling would scrub the painting. He would dissolve the blood evidence. He would burn the stretcher bar with the broken blade tip. Julian needed leverage. He needed to force Sterling's hand in a public arena where he couldn't hide. He checked his phone. It had survived the rain. 15 missed calls from Marcus. 4 from Elena. He ignored them and opened the calendar app. Friday, 7 p.m. The Metropolitan Museum of Art. The Vane Sesquicentennial Gala. Mayor's keynote address. That was it. That was the stage. Sterling wanted a showstopper? Julian would give him one. He wouldn't just reveal the painting. He would reveal the autopsy. But first, he needed to get back into the game. He needed equipment. He needed allies. And he needed to retrieve the painting from the hospital basement before Sterling's goons found it. He dialed Elena's number. She picked up on the first ring. "Julian, are you alive? The police are swarming the loading dock. They found the van." "I'm out," Julian said, his voice flat and calm. "Elena, listen to me carefully. They didn't find the painting, did they?" "No. They're tearing the radiology lab apart. But they think you took it with you." "Good. It's in the sub-basement. Mechanical room, Sector 4. Behind the main transformer. Wedged against the wall." "Julian, I can't." "You don't have to touch it," Julian interrupted. "Just watch it. Make sure no one takes it. I'm coming back for it. But not yet." "What are you going to do?" Elena asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to prepare a presentation," Julian said, stepping out of the ATM booth into the morning light. The rain had stopped. The sun was breaking through the clouds, illuminating the city that Elias Vane had once painted. Sterling wants the world to see the true Elias Vane. I'm going to make sure they do. He hung up. He buttoned his ruined jacket, hid the letter in his breast pocket, and walked into the crowd. He looked like a homeless man, but he walked with the purpose of an executioner. The restoration was finished. The deconstruction was about to begin. The neon sign of the Starlight Motor Inn in Queens buzzed with the sound of a dying insect, casting an intermittent, sickly pink glow across the cheap laminate desk where Julian Thorne sat hunched over a laptop he had purchased for cash at a pawn shop an hour ago. The room smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, a far cry from the climate-controlled sterility of his studio or the marble halls of the Met, but it was the only sanctuary he had left. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, leaving the city slick and glistening under a heavy gray sky. But inside, the storm was just beginning. Julian wasn't a hacker, nor was he a spy. He was a man who spent his life worrying about the expansion coefficients of linen and the light fastness of cadmium red. But desperation is a rapid teacher. On the desk, illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screen, lay the pieces of the puzzle. The fragile, yellowed confession letter of Eleanor Vane, now flattened under a piece of glass from a picture frame he'd pulled off the motel wall, the shattered remains of the apothecary vial, and the flash drive containing the high-resolution infrared scans and the raw X-ray data Elena had managed to export before the security lockdown. Julian's fingers flew across the keyboard, his eyes burning with exhaustion. He was assembling a weapon, not of steel or lead, but of light and information. He used a cracked version of Adobe Premiere, layering the X-ray imagery over the high-res photo of the painting, syncing the transitions to the specific wavelengths that would strip away the lies of Elias Vane. He scanned the letter, enhancing the faded ink until the terrified scrawl of the dead woman screamed from the screen. He wasn't just making a slideshow. He was building a digital autopsy that he intended to perform live in front of the most powerful people in New York. But to do that, he needed two things: access to the Met's projection system and the painting itself. The painting had to be there. It had to be physically present on the easel. The audience needed to see the beautiful lie in order to understand the hideous truth. If the easel was empty, it was just a story. With the painting, it was an indictment. His phone, a burner prepaid device, buzzed on the nightstand. It was Elena. They stopped searching the sub-basement. Her voice was a whisper, barely audible over the sound of what sounded like a cafeteria background. Sterling's team pulled out. They think you left the building with the painting. They're combing the tri-state area. The police are checking your apartment, your studio, even your ex-wife's house in Connecticut. Good, Julian said, his voice raspy. They're looking outward. They're not looking down. Julian, the painting is still behind the transformer. But the hospital engineers are scheduled for a routine boiler inspection at noon. If they go back there, they'll find it. You have 3 hours. I'm coming back, Julian said, standing up and grabbing his jacket. But I can't walk out with it. Not the way I came in. I need a Trojan horse. A what? A laundry cart. The big canvas ones. Meet me at the loading dock service elevator. And Elena, bring a pair of scrubs. The return to NYU Medical Center was a masterclass in invisibility. Julian, wearing a baseball cap pulled low and carrying a clipboard he'd stolen from the motel front desk, walked through the employee entrance with the weary confidence of a man who belonged there. He met Elena in the linen closet on the 3rd floor. She looked pale, her eyes darting nervously at the door, but she handed him a bundle of blue surgical scrubs and an ID badge clipped to a lanyard. "It belongs to Dr. Eris," she murmured as Julian pulled the scrub top over his street clothes. "He's on sabbatical. Don't let anyone scan it." "You're saving history, Elena," Julian said, pausing to squeeze her shoulder. "I'm losing my tenure," she shot back, though her grip on his arm was firm. "Go. The service elevator is locked from the outside. I'll override it from the nurse's station for 30 seconds. Go." Julian navigated the corridors, pushing a large, wheeled canvas laundry bin filled with soiled sheets. He felt exposed, naked, despite the disguise. Every doctor passing by, every nurse checking a chart, felt like a threat. He reached the service elevator, watching the red light above the call button. It flickered green.
Elena.
He shoved the cart inside and hit the button for the subbasement. The descent was slow, the mechanical groan of the cables echoing his own internal tension. When the doors opened, the heat of the boiler room hit him again, smelling of oil and old dust. He abandoned the cart and sprinted towards Sector 4. The The alcove behind the transformer was dark and untouched. Julian squeezed into the gap, his heart leaping into his throat. For a second, he couldn't feel the frame. Had they found it? Then his fingers brushed against the cold, carved wood. It was still there. The lady's afternoon tea waited in the darkness, a queen in exile. He dragged the painting out, wincing as the heavy frame scraped against the concrete floor. He checked the surface. The Tyvek and cardboard he had hastily reapplied were torn, but the canvas seemed intact. He hauled it back to the elevator and wrestled it into the laundry cart, burying it deep beneath a mountain of blood-stained surgical linens and gray hospital gowns. It was an ignoble carriage for a masterpiece, but fitting for a crime scene. The ride up to the loading dock was the longest minute of Julian's life. He wasn't aiming for the exit he used before. He was heading for the biohazard disposal bay. The doors opened. The bay was bustling with activity. Trucks from a medical waste disposal company were being loaded with red bags. Julian pushed the cart casually, head down, aiming for the gap between two idling trucks. His van, the nondescript Ford Transit, was parked on the street just beyond the gate, where he had left it after retrieving it from the impound lot using a spare key and a bribe to a drowsy attendant earlier that morning. "Hey, you!" Julian froze. A dock foreman in a yellow vest was pointing at him. "That bin goes to the sterilization unit, not the street. What are you doing?" Julian turned, channeling every ounce of exhausted frustration he could muster. He pointed to the ID badge on his chest. "Eris, infectious disease. We have a suspected Class A containment breach in this load. I'm transferring it to the mobile isolation unit for immediate incineration protocols. Unless you want to open it and breathe the spores yourself?" The foreman hesitated. The magic words containment breach and spores, the same lie he'd used on the guard Kevin, worked on a primal level. Fear of the invisible outweighed bureaucratic procedure. "Class A?" The foreman stepped back, waving his hand frantically. "Get it out of here. Just get it out." Julian nodded grimly and pushed the cart down the ramp, the wheels clattering loudly on the asphalt. He reached the street, shoved the cart behind his van, and heaved the painting out from under the dirty sheets. He slid it into the back of the van, slammed the doors, and was behind the wheel before the foreman could change his mind. He merged into the mid-morning traffic of First Avenue, the painting secure in the back. But now came the hardest part. He had the painting. He had the data. But the gala started in 8 hours. He drove north, towards the Upper East Side. He wasn't going to hide the painting anymore. He was going to give it back. At 2 p.m., a courier van from Manhattan Fine Art Logistics, a defunct company whose magnetic decals Julian still had in his glove box, pulled up to the service entrance of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The driver, a man in a jumpsuit and a cap pulled low, unloaded a large, flat crate marked urgent. Vein restoration, return. Julian signed the delivery manifest himself with an illegible scrawl and handed it to the confused loading dock security guard. "What is this?" the guard asked, checking his clipboard. "We didn't have a scheduled return for the vein. We thought it was missing." "Sterling ordered a rush job," Julian said, his voice bored and clipped. "Found a localized fungal bloom. Had to be treated off-site. He wants it on the easel by 4 p.m. for the lighting check. You want to call him and tell him it's stuck on the dock? Be my guest. I hear he's in a great mood today." The guard paled. The rumors of Sterling's rampage over the missing painting had evidently circulated through the entire staff. No one wanted to be the person who delayed the return of the prodigal son. "All right, leave it," the guard muttered, buzzing the gate open. "I'll radio the prep team." Julian watched from the rearview mirror as 2 art handlers came out and gently lifted the crate, containing Eleanor Vane and her deadly secret, and carried it into the bowels of the museum. A dark smile touched his lips. The Trojan horse was inside. Sterling would be relieved. He would think he had won. He would think the crazy restorer had panicked, cleaned the painting, and returned it anonymously to avoid prosecution. Sterling would inspect it, see it was visibly undamaged, and rush it to the stage to save his reputation. He wouldn't look at the back. He wouldn't check the stretcher bars. He wouldn't know the note was gone. Now Julian had to get himself inside. The Met is a fortress, but like all fortresses, it has weak points known only to the people who maintain it. Julian drove the van 3 blocks south and parked it in a garage. He stripped off the jumpsuit, revealing a tuxedo he had bought at a thrift store. It was slightly ill-fitting, tight in the shoulders, but in the dim light of a gala, he would look like any other waiter or low-level donor. He didn't enter through the front or the loading dock. He went to the old coal chute entrance on the west side, a rusted grate hidden behind a row of hedges that hadn't been used since the 1950s. Julian knew about it because he had once retrieved a stray cat from the tunnel during a winter storm. He pried the grate open with a tire iron, the metal groaning in protest, and slid into the darkness. The tunnel was narrow, crawling with cobwebs and smelling of century-old soot. He crawled on his hands and knees, his tuxedo collecting gray dust, his laptop bag dragged behind him. The tunnel emptied into the sub-basement of the American wing. Julian emerged in a mechanical room, dusting himself off. He navigated the back corridors, avoiding cameras by sticking to the blind spots he had memorized over 15 years of employment. He made his way up to the mezzanine level, overlooking the Great Hall. The transformation was already underway. The space was being turned into a glittering ballroom. Round tables with white linens, massive floral arrangements of white hydrangeas, and a stage erected in front of the Temple of Dender. And there, center stage, covered in a black velvet cloth, stood the easel. Julian checked his watch. 5:30 p.m. The audiovisual technicians were setting up the control booth at the back of the hall. This was his target. He waited in the shadows of a pharaonic statue, watching the crew. They were a third-party contractor, tired and overworked. "Hey, Tony!" one of them shouted. "I'm going to grab a smoke. Watch the board." Yeah. The other guy grumbled, scrolling through his phone. Julian seized the moment. He walked briskly towards the booth, straightening his tie, holding his laptop with authority. "Excuse me," he said, stepping into the booth. "Mr. Sterling sent me. There's a last-minute update to the keynote presentation file." The tech Tony looked up, bored. "Sterling?" He didn't radio down. "He's a little busy screaming at the caterers," Julian quipped, flashing a sympathetic smile. "He wants to add a high-res zoom of the brushwork. You know how he is about educational value." Tony snorted. "Tell me about it." "All right, just drop it in the folder marked gala_main. Don't mess with the cues." "Wouldn't dream of it," Julian said. He plugged his flash drive into the main console. His hands were steady, surgical. He opened the folder. He saw the file named vein_gala_presentation_final, PPTX. He didn't delete it. He renamed it vein_gala_presentation_LD, PPTX. Then he dragged his own file, the _truth, MP4, into the folder and renamed it vein_gala_presentation_final, PPTX. It was a simple swap. A file for a file. A lie for a truth. "Done," Julian said, pulling the drive. "Thanks, Tony. You're a lifesaver." "Yeah, whatever," Tony muttered, not looking up from his game. Julian walked away, his heart pounding a rhythm against his ribs that felt like a war drum. He merged into the catering staff who were setting tables, grabbing a tray of empty champagne flutes to blend in. He found a spot in the shadows of the Egyptian wing, behind a massive sandstone column, where he had a direct line of sight to the stage. 6:45 p.m. The doors opened. The elite of New York began to pour in. It was a sea of black tuxedos and shimmering gowns, diamonds catching the light, laughter echoing off the ancient stone walls. Julian watched them with a detached coldness. They were here to celebrate a murder, drinking champagne over a crime scene. He saw Sterling near the entrance, shaking hands, looking flushed but triumphant. Beside him was Marcus Hale, scanning the crowd with hawk-like intensity. They were relaxed. They had the painting. They had the guests. They thought the danger had passed. 7:15 p.m. The lights dimmed. The crowd hushed. Sterling walked onto the stage, the spotlight catching the sheen of sweat on his forehead. He approached the podium, smiling that practiced, shark-like smile. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sterling's voice boomed through the speakers. "Thank you for joining us on this historic evening. Tonight, we do not just celebrate art. We celebrate the resilience of beauty. We celebrate the return of a masterpiece that has defined American elegance for 150 years. He gestured to the covered easel behind him. "There were rumors," Sterling chuckled, a self-deprecating sound. "Rumors of damage, of danger. But as you can see, true art survives the storms. I give you Elias Vane's The Ladies' Afternoon Tea." He pulled the velvet cloth. The painting stood there, glowing under the spotlights. The red dress was vibrant, the face of Eleanor Vane pale and serene, the rose in her hand delicate and pink. The crowd gasped in admiration, applause rippling through the hall. Julian, hidden in the shadows, reached into his pocket. He wasn't relying on the tech crew to press play. He had paired his phone to the laptop in the booth via a remote desktop app he'd installed during the file swap. He looked at the painting. He looked at Sterling. "Smile for the camera, Arthur," Julian whispered. He pressed the button on his phone. On the massive projection screen suspended above the stage, which was intended to show a magnified image of the rose, the feed cut. The static logo of the Met vanished. The screen went black for a heartbeat. Then, a single line of white text appeared, typed out in the font of an old typewriter. "November 14th, 1889. The applause faltered. Murmurs began to ripple through the room. Sterling turned around, confused. He looked at the tech booth, waving his hand. "A technical glitch," Sterling laughed nervously into the microphone. "If we could just..." The text on the screen faded, and then the image appeared. It was the painting, but it wasn't the one on the easel. It was the infrared scan. The red dress turned gray. The room turned dark. And on the screen, massive and undeniable, the rose in Eleanor's hand dissolved. The dagger appeared. The crowd went silent. A dead, suffocating silence. Sterling froze. He stared up at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a fish. Julian's thumb hovered over the next cue. He wasn't done. He was just getting started. "Look at her," Julian whispered from the darkness. "Look at what she's holding." He swiped the screen of his phone. The projection zoomed in. The blade of the dagger sharpened. And then, the image crossfaded to the X-ray. The flesh of the hand became bone. The canvas became a weave. And the rose became a jagged, broken shard of metal embedded in the wood of the stretcher bar. On stage, the Real painting seemed to vibrate with the energy of the exposure. The woman in red was no longer smiling. In the context of the giant screen above her, her expression was a scream. "Cut the feed," Sterling shrieked, his voice cracking. "Cut the power." But it was too late. The narrative had been hijacked. The file continued to play. The text of the confession letter began to scroll over the image of the hidden body in the background. "He is in the walls. Arthur is in the walls." Julian stepped out from behind the column. He adjusted his jacket. He didn't run. He didn't hide. He began to walk slowly down the center aisle, towards the stage, as the room erupted into chaos around him.